The Duke of Ashbourne was, to all who had the privilege of knowing him, a gentleman of undeniable consequence. His presence commanded immediate respect, whether in the gilded halls of Parliament or beneath the glittering chandeliers of a ballroom. To converse with His Grace, however briefly, was a distinction in itself. To win his approval, a triumph to be boasted of for weeks thereafter. Yet behind the elegance of his attire and the authority of his manner, there resided a heart peculiarly insensible to the subtler movements of sentiment. For though the Duke excelled in matters of governance, and could dissect the intricacies of trade or finance with admirable precision, he remained astonishingly blind to the subtler movements of sentiment. It never once occurred to him that beneath the very roof of the court, amidst its endless chatter and ceaseless festivities, a quiet devotion had long been directed towards him, silent, constant, and unseen. The court itself was rife with speculation. Among the ladies adorned in jewels and lace, many cherished the hope that His Grace's discerning eye might, by some miracle, fall upon them. Others, less ambitious, confined themselves to dreams no one would dare confess aloud. But amidst these rivalries, intrigues, and whispered ambitions, there lingered a presence unnoticed, a watchful gaze, tender in its constancy, that followed the Duke with unwavering fidelity. His Grace, alas, was in complete ignorance. To him the court was a theatre of duty rather than of confidences, a place for alliances rather than affections. He seldom lingered upon small gestures, never considered a word spoken at just the right moment, nor a glance that lasted a little too long. And thus he moved through his daily obligations, unknowing that a story of the most delicate and secret affection was already being woven about him, so close that it might be said to dwell in the very air he breathed, yet hidden too well for him to perceive.
In the early days, the tokens of affection appeared so slight, so inconsequential, that even the most attentive observer might have dismissed them as chance. A book, placed with unerring precision upon the very table the Duke was most inclined to frequent. A rose, cut with unusual delicacy, left where his gaze could not fail to rest upon it. A phrase of encouragement, spoken at the precise instant when some vexation threatened his composure. Each, when regarded in isolation, amounted to nothing. Yet taken together, these gestures formed a pattern so constant that one might wonder how His Grace contrived to overlook it. But the Duke was a man who prided himself on discernment in affairs of gravity, and for that very reason he regarded all trifles with impatience. He was not a creature to indulge in speculation where sentiment was concerned. Thus, when the mysterious attentions first intruded upon his notice, he dismissed them as mere coincidences, the natural consequence of servants dutiful in their care, or acquaintances anxious for his esteem. Yet the persistence of these subtle signs, appearing always when most needed, began to vex him. He could not reconcile such attentiveness with the indifference he believed others held towards him, nor could he imagine that any single hand might guide so quiet a campaign of devotion. At times he even entertained the notion of some elaborate jest designed at his expense, though who in court would dare attempt such boldness he could not determine. The irony, most delicious to any observer privy to the truth, was that while the Duke prided himself on vigilance and rationality, he stood perpetually surrounded by evidence of a heart wholly devoted to him, a lingering glance when he was otherwise occupied, a hand that steadied his papers at the precise moment a draught threatened them, a smile suppressed before it could betray too much, All lay before him in plain sight, and yet entirely unseen. Thus the mystery deepened, a secret affection pressing forward through shadows, while his Grace, unknowing, began to feel the faintest stirrings of curiosity, though he would never have admitted it to himself.
The court, ever fertile ground for speculation, soon busied itself with conjectures regarding the Duke's mysterious admirer. For though no one could point with certainty to the origin of those delicate attentions, it was generally agreed that they must proceed from some female hand, since who else in all creation would trouble themselves with so romantic a pursuit? "Depend upon it," declared Lady Cecily Morton one evening as the company assembled before supper, "His Grace's affections are already engaged. A man does not look so grave unless his heart is in danger of being softened." Her companion, the Countess of Harrowgate, raised a brow, her smile as artful as the pearls about her neck. "Grave? My dear Lady Cecily, the Duke has ever been grave. If sobriety of countenance is proof of passion, then he has loved us all equally since the hour of his birth." The surrounding ladies tittered, though not without unease, for each was conscious of her own secret hopes. The Duke himself, who had entered in time to overhear this playful remark, regarded the Countess with polite indifference. "Madam," he said coolly, "if I am grave, it is not because I am in love, but because I am surrounded by so many who appear determined to be otherwise." The company laughed, though some more nervously than others. Lady Cecily, who had resolved to be not silenced, leaned toward him with studied sweetness. "And yet, Your Grace, we hear whispers, little tokens of admiration, left, no doubt, to delight and flatter you. Surely you must have some suspicion as to their origin." The Duke's expression betrayed a flicker of irritation. "I am in the habit of regarding whispers as idle, Lady Cecily. They rarely lead to anything worth a man's attention." Eleanor Whitcomb, seated a little apart from the principal circle, listened in silence. As merely a companion to Lady Harrowgate's daughter, her presence was scarcely noticed, yet her heart trembled at every word. For was it not she who had placed the rose upon his desk, and she whose hand had guided those small acts of comfort? She dared not raise her eyes, for fear that even her glance might betray what her position in society forbade her to speak. Meanwhile, the speculation continued, names whispered and dismissed in turn. Some swore it must be Lady Cecily, with her unabashed forwardness. Others insisted upon the Countess, with her talent for intrigue. That the truth might lie elsewhere, quiet, modest, and hidden in plain sight, never once crossed their minds. The evening of Lady Harrowgate's grand ball was one of such brilliance that the chandeliers themselves seemed to tremble with pride. Every guest of consequence had assembled, eager to display wit, fortune, or, failing those, an enviable gown. The Duke of Ashbourne entered to immediate acclaim, as though his presence alone lent the evening its distinction. He, however, was in no humor to be flattered. Of late, the unseen hand guiding his steps had become more persistent, too persistent to be ignored. A misplaced paper in his study, discovered only because someone had rescued it from the fire. A letter, unsigned, offering counsel on a political alliance. Even his favorite wine, poured at table without his ever requesting it. These were not accidents, they were intentions. As the music struck up, Lady Cecily descended upon him with determination. "Your Grace," she said, extending her hand, "you cannot refuse me the honor of the first dance."
The Duke inclined his head, though without enthusiasm. "I fear refusal, Lady Cecily, is a skill of which I am daily robbed, but if it will spare me your reproach, I am at your service." Her smile widened, triumphant, as she allowed him to lead her onto the floor. Yet the conversation that followed proved less gratifying. "I have long suspected," she said, with a coy glance, "that you are not quite as impervious to admiration as you pretend. Do you deny it?" "I deny nothing," he replied, evenly, "except the pleasure of being the subject of idle speculation." She pouted, but before she could retort, the dance obliged them to separate. The Duke's gaze, wandering in that moment, fell upon a quieter corner of the room where Miss Eleanor Whitcomb stood, attending her young charge with modest diligence. Her dress was simple, her countenance composed, and yet was it his imagination, or had her eyes retreated the instant they met his? When the dance concluded, he sought refuge from Lady Harrogate's attentions by retreating towards the refreshment table. There, quite by accident, or so he believed, his glass slipped from his hand. Before it could shatter, another hand, slender and sure, caught it. "Forgive me, Your Grace," came a gentle voice. "I trust I did not startle you." It was Miss Whitcomb. She stood before him, her composure marred only by the faintest flush upon her cheek. "You startled me only by your quickness," the Duke replied, studying her with new interest. "It seems you were better prepared than I." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "One grows accustomed to watching closely, sir. It is the habit of a companion." There was something in her manner, neither bold nor servile, that unsettled him. For the first time, he entertained the possibility that his mysterious benefactor was not one of the ladies vying openly for his notice, but someone who preferred concealment. Before he could pursue the thought, Lady Harrogate swept in with fresh greetings, and Eleanor slipped back into the crowd as though she had never been there at all. Yet the Duke's doubts had been stirred, and with them an intrigue unlike any he had yet encountered. Several days after the ball, the Duke retreated to his library, his favorite refuge from the tiresome gaieties of society. The rain tapped insistently at the tall windows, and the room's silence seemed to invite reflection. He had resolved, once and for all, to think seriously on the matter of his invisible admirer. As he drew a volume from the shelf, a folded paper slipped from its pages and fell at his feet. With a frown, he stooped to retrieve it. The hand was delicate, the words few, but their import undeniable. "Courage is not always found in conquest. Sometimes it resides in silence. Your well-wisher." The Duke stared at the lines, his brow knit. There was something faintly familiar in the script, though he could not immediately place it. At that precise moment, the door opened and Lady Cecily entered, all grace and affected surprise. "Oh, Your Grace, forgive my intrusion," she exclaimed. "I had hoped to borrow a book, though I see I am disturbing you." "You disturb me less than this paper," he said, holding it aloft. "Pray tell me, does this hand resemble yours? For I fancy I have seen you write in a similar fashion." Lady Cecily's eyes sparkled. "Why, how very curious! Indeed, I do keep a small journal, though I should blush to have its pages compared with anything so noble as a letter addressed to you." The insinuation was plain. She wished him to believe the mystery was solved, that she herself had authored the tokens. Yet there was something in her tone, a rehearsed eagerness, that struck him as contrived. "You admit too easily," he replied coldly. A lady who means to remain unknown does not step forward at the first suspicion. Lady Cecily coloured, but affected to laugh. "Oh, your Grace, you are too severe. What harm in a little admiration?" Before he could answer, a movement in the corridor caught his attention. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb passed by, carrying a tray of correspondence for Lady Harrowgate. The Duke noticed for the first time the steadiness of her hand as she bore the letters. Could it be that hers was the script which so haunted him? But the thought no sooner presented itself than he dismissed it. A mere companion, so modest and unassuming, surely such a creature would never dare. Still, as Eleanor vanished down the hall, the Duke found his certainty shaken. Lady Cecily's too ready claim, Eleanor's retreating figure, and the silent paper in his hand, all pressed upon him with a mystery not yet solved. To the world at large, Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was of little consequence. She was neither wealthy nor celebrated for beauty, nor inclined to seek admiration in any form. Her position as companion to Lady Harrowgate's daughter demanded modesty, vigilance, and a cheerful surrender of her own inclinations. In assemblies, she remained in the shadows. In conversation, she yielded the ground to others. Many would have declared her invisible had they troubled themselves to think of her at all. And yet it was she. It was Eleanor whose hand had traced the delicate lines that now perplexed the Duke. It was she who had arranged that a rose should be left upon his desk, who had intervened silently at countless small moments when his dignity or comfort might otherwise have been compromised. She had never intended him to know. Her heart, though tender, was guided by a principle of concealment. Better to cherish a secret devotion, however hopeless, than to expose herself to ridicule or, worse, his indifference. That her feelings had grown beyond her command, Eleanor readily acknowledged. She could not in truth recall the precise hour when admiration first deepened into affection. Perhaps it was when she observed his kindness to a child who had stumbled in the gardens, lifting the boy with a gentleness that belied his stern exterior. Or perhaps it was on that evening when his counsel, firm but just, prevented a foolish quarrel from rupturing the harmony of an entire household. Whatever the moment, her heart had chosen, and it had chosen irrevocably. Yet Eleanor knew the vanity of her attachment. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man destined for splendor, and she was but a shadow in the corner of his eye. Never for a moment did she permit herself the indulgence of believing he might return what she so carefully concealed. Her greatest satisfaction lay in remaining unseen, in giving where she could, and in loving without hope of reward. Still, the smallest tremor of fear began to stir within her. His Grace had grown restless, his questions more pointed, his observations keener, and though he looked past her now, she could not help but feel that one day his eyes might linger long enough to discern the truth. It was during a dinner at Lord Chatham's residence that fate conspired to loosen the veil Eleanor had so carefully maintained. The company was large, the conversation noisy, and politics, always a dangerous subject, had ignited a quarrel between two gentlemen at the far end of the table. Words grew sharp, tempers heated, and before long one accused the Duke of Ashbourne himself of harboring undue influence over the matter. The Duke's brow darkened. "Sir," he said with chilling composure, "you mistake the nature of my involvement. I do not meddle where my name has not been invited." The gentleman, emboldened by claret, sneered.
And yet we hear whispers, letters perhaps, unsigned, guiding your hand. If such counsel exists, who is its author? Some hidden confidant? The room hushed. Speculation rippled like a current through the assembly. Lady Cecily nearly swooned with eagerness. The Countess of Harrowgate leaned forward, eyes gleaming. All awaited the Duke's reply. But before he could speak, a voice, soft yet steady, rose from the shadows of the room. "Those letters," said Eleanor Whitcomb, her cheeks pale but her gaze unwavering, "were mine." A gasp escaped several throats. The company turned, astonished, for who could have suspected the quiet companion, so modest, so unremarkable, to stand forth in such a moment? The Duke himself was struck silent. He regarded her as though seeing her for the first time. "Miss Whitcomb," he said at last, his voice low, "do you comprehend what you are admitting?" "I do, Your Grace," she answered, "but I cannot endure to see falsehoods prosper when truth is at hand. The counsel was mine. If blame is to fall, let it fall upon me." A murmur rose around the table, half scandal, half disbelief. Lady Cecily colored with indignation. The Countess of Harrowgate pressed her lips into a smile too sharp to be kind. Yet Eleanor stood firm, her hands folded, her bearing simple but dignified. The Duke, after a long pause, inclined his head. "Your candor, madam, has spared me a greater injustice. For that I am indebted." And though the dinner resumed with forced gaiety, the Duke's thoughts were far from his plate. His mind instead lingered on the quiet woman who had dared speak for him when others would have watched him fall. For the first time he began to ask himself, who was Miss Eleanor Whitcomb? The Duke of Ashburn found himself alone in the library the following morning, the earlier events of dinner replaying in his mind with every detail sharply etched. The world, with all its pomp and expectation, had become a backdrop to a single consuming thought. Eleanor Whitcomb, his quiet, modest companion, was the architect of all the attentions that had long puzzled him. He did not summon her immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and studied the gardens, as though in their ordered symmetry he might find counsel. Yet every blossom reminded him of the roses she had left upon his desk. Every perfectly pruned shrub suggested the careful thought with which she had guided his affairs, always unseen. At last he turned. "Miss Whitcomb," he called, his voice firm yet uncertain, "I must speak with you." Eleanor appeared, calm though her heart betrayed a subtle flutter. "Your Grace?" she asked, bowing her head in the familiar, respectful way she had long adopted. He gestured for her to approach. "You have shown attentions of which I was wholly unaware. I must confess I am at a loss. Tell me, why? Why conceal what you have done so carefully?" Eleanor hesitated, then found courage in the honesty of the moment. "Your Grace, I feared that such feelings, if revealed, might be unwelcome. I had no claim to your notice, yet my heart could not remain silent even if my voice did." The Duke studied her in astonishment. The modesty of her posture, the simplicity of her attire, and the quiet intensity of her gaze were nothing like the flamboyant gestures he had been conditioned to notice. And yet, in that very quiet, he found a power that left him both confounded and deeply moved. "You mean," he said slowly, "that all the roses, the letters, the counsel, it was you?" "Yes, Your Grace, all of it. Every small act was meant only to serve you and to protect you when I could, nothing more." The Duke exhaled sharply. "And I never saw it." Her lips curved faintly. "Perhaps you were not meant to, until now." A silence followed, rich with the weight of revelation. For the first time, the Duke felt a tenderness he had never acknowledged, a vulnerability that rendered him uncharacteristically unsure. And yet, in that uncertainty, a new clarity emerged. Eleanor, hidden so long in plain sight, had claimed his admiration before he even recognized her worth. He reached out, hesitated, then allowed his hand to brush hers, tentatively, as though touching something fragile. He had thought, he murmured, that what one sees is all that exists, yet it seems the truest devotion may dwell where the eye fails to notice. Eleanor's gaze lifted, steady and unwavering. "And it is here, Your Grace, whether noticed or not, that my heart has always been." The Duke at last understood. The mystery that had eluded him for so long, the source of both intrigue and vexation, was no longer hidden. And in that realization a profound shift occurred, a bridge from duty to desire, from ignorance to understanding. The following days at Ashbourne Hall were filled with a peculiar mixture of anticipation and unease. The court, ever alert to whispers and scandals, had already begun to murmur. Some admired Eleanor's courage, while others whispered that a mere companion had overstepped the bounds of her station. Yet the Duke appeared undeterred, his mind now fully occupied by thoughts of her rather than the endless formalities of rank and duty. Eleanor, for her part, carried herself with a new awareness. She was no longer merely a shadow in the periphery of courtly life. Her actions, once secret, had been laid bare, and the Duke's recognition made her courage greater than she had thought possible. "Your Grace," she said one afternoon, as they walked together in the quiet garden, "I had feared that my confession might render our acquaintance awkward, that I had endangered your regard." The Duke regarded her with a gentle gravity, one not often seen. "On the contrary, Miss Whitcomb, you have revealed a truth that I had long overlooked. I find myself grateful, indeed indebted, not merely for your care, but for your honesty." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yet what are we to do now? The world is rarely kind to those who step outside their allotted place." He took her hand, unhesitatingly this time. "The world can speculate and whisper, but it cannot alter what I have come to feel, nor shall it dictate whom I choose to regard with esteem or with affection." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden entrance of Lady Cecily, whose curiosity had drawn her to the garden. Her gaze swept the scene, sharp and measuring. "Your Grace," she said, voice edged with mock concern, "I trust the company of Miss Whitcomb is satisfactory." The Duke smiled faintly, a smile of subtle authority. "Entirely, Lady Cecily. I find her company both enlightening and agreeable." The lady's composure faltered, and she departed with a grace that was more wounded than elegant. Eleanor, still holding his hand, allowed herself quiet exhalation. "I feared she would never permit this serenity," Eleanor said softly. "You feared correctly," the Duke admitted. "Yet, in truth, it is not the world's whispers that shall govern my regard, but the steadfastness of the heart before me." And so, amid the quiet scandal of the court and the murmurs of intrigued observers, a new dynamic emerged. Eleanor no longer moved in shadow. The Duke, once blind to subtle devotion, now recognized her courage and sincerity. Together they stepped cautiously into a future unknown, but no longer unshared. The autumn air at Ashbourne Hall carried a clarity that mirrored the Duke's own newfound understanding. The days, once measured solely by duty and decorum, now bore a subtle warmth, a recognition of what had long been near yet unseen. Eleanor Whitcomb, once a shadow at court, moved with a quiet confidence, no longer content to hide the affection that had guided so many of the Duke's small comforts. In the morning gardens they walked side by side, speaking in tones soft enough to escape the notice of servants and observers, yet profound enough to shape the course of their lives. "You have changed my world, Eleanor," the Duke admitted, his voice a mixture of admiration and wonder. "I had believed that love was revealed in bold gestures, in declarations that could not be ignored. Yet it was here," he gestured to the subtle elegance of her presence, "all along, in a quiet constancy I never perceived." Eleanor's hand found his, lightly resting in his grasp. "Perhaps that is the nature of true affection, Your Grace. It does not demand recognition, nor flaunt itself. It merely waits, patiently, until the hearth is ready to see it." The Duke looked at her, his expression contemplative. "And now, having seen it, I find myself wishing I had understood sooner. How blind we can be, even to the closest of hearts." In the halls and salons, whispers persisted, as they always do. Some congratulated the Duke, others muttered at the audacity of a companion daring to claim such regard, but neither he nor Eleanor allowed such murmurs to disturb them. They moved forward, their alliance forged in secrecy, but now tempered by honesty, respect, and mutual affection. And so the Duke of Ashbourne discovered, as many do too late, that love is often hidden in plain sight, its presence unassuming, yet immeasurably powerful. The question remained, lingering like a gentle echo in the mind of any observer. How often do we overlook the devotion that surrounds us, simply because it arrives in forms too quiet, too steadfast to demand attention? With that reflection, the court's intrigues continued, the social dances persisted. Yet for the Duke and Eleanor, a new chapter had begun, one of understanding, trust, and a love that had waited patiently, unseen, until it was finally recognized.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. Want to see the continuation of this story? Comment below and let us know what you think. Your opinion makes all the difference.